The Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939 stunned the world. Swastika and hammer and sickle shared a handshake, while Poland was carved on a map. Ideology took a holiday when state interest demanded it. German communists were arrested. Soviet propaganda spun hard to explain the pivot overnight. Stalin bought time to rebuild the Red Army after purges had shot its competence in the spine. Time bought with borderlands also bought fear for Poles and Balts. Hitler secured grain, oil, and a quiet eastern frontier while he finished the West. The pact was a truce between thieves who each planned to cheat the other. Soviet forces rolled into eastern Poland, Bessarabia, and the Baltic states. Small nations learned again they were bargaining chips, not partners. German planners studied Soviet roads, railways, and weather charts. Barbarossa was not improvised. It was postponed by Greece and Yugoslavia, not forgotten. British blockade and American lean shaped German hunger for resources. Ukraine's Black Earth glittered in Berlin briefings like a promised banquet. Soviet spies reported German concentrations. Stalin dismissed warnings as British disinformation. Dictators often hear what flatters their suspicions. The Winter War with Finland had embarrassed the Red Army. Lessons were half learned, enough to reform, not enough to prevent June's catastrophe. Japanese neutrality in April 41 freed Hitler's rear imagination. He could strike east without immediate two-front panic until Japan chose its own hour. German generals argued about logistics to the Dnieper and beyond. Optimists promised weeks, realists whispered months. Nobody imagined the full inferno. Soviet peasants and workers were told fascism was the enemy, then friend, then enemy again. Cynicism spread faster than newspapers could revise slogans. Trains moved German divisions east under moonless schedules. Europe's largest invasion force assembled like a storm stacking on a horizon. Churchill offered warnings to Moscow that Stalin read as plots. Trust between democracies and the USSR would wait until German guns made it compulsory. By June 1941, the alliance of convenience had hours left. Dawn over the Bug would open the bloodiest theater of World War II. Operation Barbarossa named itself after a medieval emperor, propaganda dressed as destiny. 3 army groups aimed at Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine like trident prongs. War plans balanced speed against supply reality. Panzer generals dreamed of encirclements. Quartermasters counted tires and spare parts with colder math. Luftwaffe sorties targeted airfields first, destroy planes on the ground, blind command. Soviet aviation losses in days would stagger statisticians. Romanian oil, Finnish flank cooperation, and Hungarian auxiliaries widened the invasion's belt. Axis Europe marched east in a patchwork uniform. SS orders followed the army like a shadow. Ideology was not an afterthought. Mass murder began as policy parallel to battle, not as accident. Soviet border deployments were forward and vulnerable. Doctrine trusted offense. Reality delivered encirclement. Peacetime maps became death diagrams. German soldiers carried summer uniforms and optimism. Propaganda promised the enemy would collapse like a rotten door kicked by a boot. Red Army ranks included recent conscripts still learning their rifles. Training depth had been traded for paper divisions and fear of initiative. Rail gauges differed, logistics groaned from day one. Victory's appetite would be fed by captured stockpiles, or not at all. Hitler's directive split priorities: Ukraine's economics versus Moscow's prestige. Argument at the top would bend timelines and cost millions of lives. Soviet civilians near the border heard rumors, then engines. Radio silence broke into sirens. Peacetime ended in smoke columns. Church bells in German villages rang for Barbarossa, as if for a crusade. Morale soared on racist certainty that Slavs would break. Neutral Turkey and Sweden watched trade and transit with calculating eyes. Neutrality is a business when continents burn. American observers noted timing. Germany now faced the two-front logic strategists had warned about for years. Geography's bill came due. At 3:15 on June 22nd, artillery opened a 1,000-kilometer front. The largest invasion in history became fact, not hypothesis. Sunrise brought Stukas, Heinkels, and Messerschmitts diving on sleeping airfields. Pilots died in pajamas, planes burned in neat rows. Border towns fell before noon. Refugees clogged roads that armies needed. War's first cruelty was often logistics wearing a human face. Radio Moscow's first bulletin sounded unreal, patriotic war. Citizens who remembered brotherhood with Berlin felt vertigo. German spearheads bypassed strongpoints and drove deep. Soviet commanders with broken radios ordered counterattacks into voids. Paratroops seized bridges. Engineers threw pontoons under fire. The opening days were a lesson in tempo. Whoever moved faster on the clock. Civilians dug trenches with garden tools. Children carried sandbags. Grandfathers remembered 1914 and whispered worse was coming. Wehrmacht discipline cracked in places into looting. Officers looked away. Ideology encouraged contempt for Eastern property and people. Soviet political officers sometimes fought to the last, sometimes vanished. Commissar presence was a double-edged morale tool under encirclement. Horses still pulled Soviet guns beside few trucks. Industrial depth existed, too far east to save the first shock. German soldiers wrote home about endless prisoners. Shock became routine. Humanity numbed mile by mile. Weather held fair, God's temporary gift to invaders. Mud season waited like a second enemy. Stalin vanished from public sight briefly. Panic and pride wrestled behind Kremlin walls. When he spoke again, it was as brother of Russians, not as infallible oracle. Peasants torched grain rather than gift invaders. Scorched earth began as folk refusal before it became state policy. The world's newspapers used banner type. Neutral capitals calculated odds. London quietly hoped the Eastern Front would bleed Germany white. Opening shock was not one battle, it was a system fracture. The USSR survived because depth, cruelty, and winter were also systems. Encirclements at Minsk and Bialystok pockets swallowed armies whole. German cameramen filmed columns of captives marching west, propaganda and truth braided. Soviet commanders with outdated radios duplicated orders or received none. Initiative starved, while headquarters moved east in panic. Tanks ran out of fuel during attacks. Supply trucks were nowhere. Courage without diesel dies in place. Luftwaffe interdiction cut rail nodes. Trains stalled. Reinforcements arrived as fragments, not divisions. German infantry mopped pockets while armor rolled onward. The doctrine worked, until distances and losses bent the spear. Soviet pilots flew obsolete planes against veterans. Kill ratios tilted obscene. Experience bought in Spain and France was spent cheaply here. Field hospitals overflowed. Triage became triage again. Surgeons operated by lantern, while trains shook with distant artillery. Prisoners died of thirst in corrals. Logistics for humanity lagged logistics for cruelty. Barbarossa's rear was a moral wasteland early. Some Soviet units escaped east through swamps and night marches. Seeds of later armies walked out of pockets on blistered feet. German intelligence underestimated reserves forming behind Moscow. Counting divisions on paper missed Soviet willingness to regenerate in blood. Hitler toured captured cities and smiled for cameras. Hubris looked like confidence when maps still bent your way. Soviet high command shot generals for failure, sometimes guilty, sometimes convenient. Fear restored obedience at a price: incompetence. Railways eastward ran evacuation trains. Factories unscrewed from floors. Workers with toolboxes and blueprints. Industrial survival became migration. German soldiers found abandoned boots in sizes that mocked supply tables. Soviet bodies were numerous. Soviet space was infinite. Frontier armies were destroyed, yet the state behind them was not. Destruction bought time. The invaders thought they had already spent. Einsatzgruppen followed the army with lists and pistols. Jews, communists, Roma, and imagined enemies were shot in pits beside villages whose names became synonyms. Wehrmacht officers signed orders that criminalized mercy. Anti-partisan sweeps often meant mass reprisals against civilians wearing any label. Local collaborators in Baltics and Ukraine sometimes joined pogroms for revenge or profit. Occupation unlocked old hatreds with new uniforms. Babi Yar near Kiev became a mass grave measured in tens of thousands. Artillery covered noise. Ash rose for days. Gas vans and experiments foreshadowed industrial killing elsewhere. Ideology scaled from bullets to budgets. German soldiers photographed atrocities. Some mailed pictures home. Desensitization was a curriculum taught by officers who looked away. Soviet propaganda used atrocity reports truthfully, mixed with exaggeration when useful. Moral clarity and political messaging braided tight. Prisoners of war starved in camps. Soviet captives were subhuman by decree. Geneva Conventions became a Western fiction to invaders. Churches in occupied zones closed or bent. Faith under occupation is a dangerous private language. Partisans began as survivors with rifles in forests. Later they became armies supplied by air. First they were ghosts. Historians debate degrees of Wehrmacht complicity. Orders, leave policies, and logistics for killing units leave little innocent room. Children saw parents shot. Trauma became recruitment for vengeance decades later. Memory is also a weapon factory. Neutral Red Cross pleas met walls. Indifference is a policy when races are classified out of humanity. Stalin's regime had its own gulags and purges. Moral equivalence fails. But invasion unlocked a German killing program of industrial scale, unique in intent. Ideology turned geography into graveyards. The Eastern Front was never only about terrain. It was about who was allowed to live on it. German and Finnish arms tightened around Leningrad in autumn '41. Hitler preferred starvation to costly assault, cynicism dressed as strategy. Lake Ladoga's ice road became the road of life when open water froze. Trucks carried crumbs of food across ice that swallowed trucks whole. Rations fell to bread measured by the slice, then by grams. People boiled wallpaper paste for gluey calories. Cats vanished from streets. Artists and musicians performed in frozen halls, defiance wearing culture's face. Shostakovich's Seventh became a siege anthem wired abroad. German artillery timed shells for dinner hours, psychological cruelty as routine. Civilians learned basements like second skins. Evacuation of children eastward saved some. Families split on platforms forever. Goodbyes became statistics. Medical staff operated by kerosene lamp without anesthetics. Gangrene and frostbite competed for ward beds that did not exist. Finnish lines stopped at pre-war borders in places. Politics limited help to Germany's hunger for Leningrad's death. Neighbors watched neighbors die through optics. Soviet counterbattery duels lit horizons. Soldiers ate what Leningrad could not. Guilt and necessity fed the same spoon. Winter 41 to 42 killed hundreds of thousands in the city. Historians still weigh numbers. Survivors weighed emptiness. Ice broke. Summer brought Luftwaffe raids again. Relief felt relative. Less hungry is not fed. Propaganda posters showed strong workers. Bodies told truth. Ideology starves last when bellies starve first. Allied convoys could not feed Leningrad directly. Arctic routes bled for Murmansk, not the inner Gulf. Geography mocked mercy. The siege lasted 900 days, longer than many wars entire. Leningrad's refusal to become a corpse became legend. Hitler never took the city took his timetable instead. Siege was a draw measured in frozen corpses, Soviet victory by not dying enough. Ukraine's breadbasket tempted Hitler toward economic strategy over Moscow obsession. Guderian's wheel south annoyed advocates of a direct capital thrust. Kiev's encirclement in September trapped more than 500,000 Soviet troops, record pockets. Railheads choked with prisoners and booty. Dnieper crossings cost blood. Engineers died tying pontoons. Rivers look small on maps and wide under fire. German soldiers photographed golden domes before looting began. Churches became warehouses. Icons became souvenirs for murderers. Partisan sparks lit behind advancing lines. Burning trains became signatures of refusal. Romanian and Hungarian corps added boots but uneven quality. Axis coalition war meant uneven sacrifice. Hitler's economic prizes included slave labor. Factories and mines swallowed people the way fronts swallowed divisions. Crimea campaigns and Odessa's defenses added months. Black Sea ports mattered to supply and prestige alike. Soviet generals learned retreat with discipline, save units, deny victory parades. Space traded for time on a ledger written in blood. Winter approached again, mud returned first. Southern roads became canals of filth that ate vehicles. Kiev's fall opened the road east, but also lengthened German logistics tongues. Every kilometer forward stretched the rubber band thinner. Ukrainian nationalism flickered. Some welcomed Germans as liberators from Stalin. Reality educated hope with bullets. Harvests burned, peasants fled. Scorched earth turned fertile plains into a weapon. German propaganda claimed a crusade against Bolshevism. Actions showed colonization and extermination. Words and deeds diverged loudly. Southern victories looked decisive on maps. Maps lied about what winters do to invaders who think they are home by Christmas. Operation Typhoon aimed at Moscow in autumn 41. Panzers drove until mud said stop, then frost said go, then logistics said maybe not. German binoculars saw the Kremlin's spires in mist, almost. Almost became the most expensive word of the campaign. Soviet reserves appeared from Siberia. Spy Richard Sorge's warnings about Japan helped shift divisions east. Intelligence bought blood cheaply once believed. Moscow's metro became a cathedral of shelter. Trains ran under citizens sleeping on platforms. Civil defense and daily life merged. Stalin stayed in the capital when others urged flight. Symbolism mattered when radios crackled with panic. Parades on November 7th marched troops straight to the front. Propaganda and necessity shared a podium in Red Square. German supply columns stretched to vulnerability. Partisans and cold snapped links like scissors. T-34s in winter, snow surprised crews used to summer kills. Soviet industries, simpler tank met mud and ice as equals. Hitler micromanaged divisions like chess pieces, sometimes delaying pulls that could have saved men for later fights. Moscow suburbs became trench mazes. Suburbs look ordinary until artillery turns them into moonscapes. Medical trains carried frostbite cases by the thousands, toes and fingers lost to gloves that never arrived. Winter war is logistics with knives. Foreign correspondents wired disbelief, blitzkrieg stalled. Headlines shifted from inevitable German victory to questions about endurance. Soviet counterattacks probed, then bit. Timid generals were replaced by harder ones. Zhukov's name rose with winter. The road to Moscow became a graveyard of vehicles abandoned in ditches. Rust became the Wehrmacht's winter medal. Typhoon failed to swallow the capital. Moscow stood. Hitler's timetable broke like ice under a tank tread. Rasputitsa, seasonal mud, turned roads to soup before deep freeze. Horses died faster than trucks. Both were too few. German soldiers wrapped newspapers under tunics for warmth. Siberian winter laughed at summer uniforms and Berlin promises. Lubricants froze, weapons jammed, engines cracked. Cold is an engineer that accepts no bribes. Soviet winter gear, felt boots, white camouflage, met German blue lips. Climate allied with the defender when doctrine failed. Overextension meant repair shops sat hundreds of kilometers behind broken tanks. Steel corpses lined the Minsk-Moscow highway trace. Hitler forbade tactical retreats that might have preserved formations. Pride became a mass gravedigger. Soviet ski troops and cavalry raids harassed flanks. Ghosts in white capes reminded invaders the rear was not safe. Field kitchens froze, calories dropped, disease rose. Armies march on stomachs, empty stomachs march nowhere. Frostbite amputations filled field hospitals like harvest. Surgeons counted stumps by candlelight. Letters home turned grim. Censors could not hide shivering sentences. German civilian morale met the eastern winter in mail sacks. Soviet factories evacuated east kept belching smoke beyond Ural ranges. Distance swallowed German bombers' reach. Allied Lend-Lease trucks later mattered enormously. Early winter, they were still promises on docks. Hope traveled slower than cold. Mud returned in spring 42. Thaw revealed corpses and rust. Seasons reset the front's color palette to brown and red. Overextension taught both sides lessons. Germans about logistics, Soviets about survival. Only one paid tuition in occupied territory. Winter 41 broke the myth of inevitable German triumph. Afterward, the Eastern War became a math problem measured in millions. GKO, State Defense Committee, centralized power with Stalin at its head. Terror softened into terror plus planning. Production became religion. Tanks rolled off lines simplified for speed, welded over riveted where needed. Quantity became its own quality when crews were brave. Women filled factories and dug anti-tank ditches. Gender roles bent under necessity. Propaganda celebrated soldiers without rifles. Evacuated scientists and workers rebuilt shops beyond bombing range. Ural and Siberian cities swallowed industry whole and learned smoke overnight. Railway troops became heroes of anonymous labor. Tracks relayed while shells fell. Logistics resurrected is a form of combat. Political officers loosened enough to let competent officers breathe. Survival selected for talent over loyalty theater. Conscription widened, training shortened. Replacements arrived green and died fast, yet kept coming. Depth meant disposable lives in cruel arithmetic. Allied convoys to Murmansk and Archangel brought aluminum, trucks, food. Percentages debated by historians. Morale effect was visible on docks. Partisan centralization grew. Radio nets supplied drops, coordinated raids. Occupation's headache became migraine. Soviet intelligence improved. Radio discipline captured documents, spy rings. Learning under fire is expensive tuition. Civilians donated scrap metal. Children collected bottles. Total war meant kitchen drawers emptied for foundries. Religion tolerated anew. Orthodox imagery allowed to bind nation. Stalinism borrowed crosses when hammer needed souls. NKVD still shot defeatists. Fear and unity braided. Recovery rode both whip and slogan. By spring 42, the Red Army was still bruised but bigger, like a boxer who learned to keep hands up after a knockdown. Emergency mobilization turned near collapse into weight. Germany had thrown a spear. The USSR became a shield that bent but did not break. Zhukov's December 41 counterattack surprised Germans who thought Soviets too bloodied to punch. Winter became an offensive season. Ski units and cavalry exploited gaps in frozen lines. Mobility returned to the side that owned felt boots. Hitler's stand fast order froze divisions into strongpoints, sometimes saved pockets, sometimes created islands surrounded by red tide. Arzhev salient fighting turned into a meat grinder for years, less glamorous than Moscow relief, but equally costly. German veterans called the winter Generalfeldmarschall Schnee. Jokes hid trauma. Frostbite statistics hid policy failures. Soviet gains were modest on maps, enormous in meaning. Moscow breathed. Berlin's planning room snarled. Media photos showed Red Army soldiers in German helmets, trophies and necessity. War's recycling yard is macabre practical. Japanese decision for southern expansion kept Siberian divisions available. Global war's timing is a seesaw continent's ride. Lend-Lease winter clothing began arriving, late for some, life-saving for others. Allies became lifelines stitch by stitch. German airfields iced, sorties dropped. Control of sky slackened. Soviet observation balloons returned like slow moons. Counteroffensive logistics were Soviet too. Men fed on black bread and hope. Offensives run on calories, not speeches. Prisoners taken in winter counterattacks faced cruelty descending both directions. Eastern Front POW math ignored Geneva. Hitler sacked generals who told truth. Yes men learned to parrot fantasies until maps contradicted them loudly. Moscow's survival propaganda circled globe, Radio Free French and London cheered. Morale is international currency. The counteroffensive did not win the war, it proved the war would be long. Germany's eastern gamble met its first immovable winter wall. Barbarossa's failure to finish in one season rewrote global strategy. Hitler faced a bleeding ulcer that would drain men and metal until Berlin's fall. America watched while arming Britain. Sooner or later economics would pull the United States fully in. Neutrality eroded with each convoy argument. Japan calculated Siberian weakness versus Southern oil. Decisions in Tokyo shaped whether Stalin could shift divisions west again. Ukraine's fields would be fought over again and again. Kursk and Kharkov waited in future years. Geography remembered invaders' names. Soviet society hardened into siege mentality. Less debate, more work. Dictatorship's efficiency is mixed with tragedy. German occupation policies ensured hatred. Reaping that hatred took 4 years of Soviet offensives to harvest. Civilians from Minsk to Stalingrad learned new calendars, marked by retreats, rations, rumors. Time became a weapon both sides wielded differently. Historians mark December 41 as psychological hinge. Allies exhaled slightly. Axis partners wondered quietly about paying for Hitler's obsessions. Red Army losses stagger imagination. Millions dead, captured, wounded. Replacement math defies peacetime morality. Wehrmacht losses also mounted. Experienced NCOs and officers did not regenerate like rifles. Quality eroded even when lines held. Ideological war meant few prisoners returned home unchanged, if they returned. Eastern Front cruelty lowered the floor for everyone. Stalingrad on the horizon would become the next name for hell. This episode ends with the certainty that the East would burn for years. Britain bombed Germany while Soviets bled east. Global fronts linked in factories and oceans. World war meant no single theater could be ignored. Neutral states recalculated bets. Survival often meant feeding the tiger, just enough to avoid being eaten. Hitler's turn east did not end the USSR. It bound Germany to a fight of continents and seasons. The modern world shape was being forged in blood and ice.